Let's go over here. Let's go like that. So we finished section 3, your immune system. Like such. I need that, and I need that, and I need that. All right, so let's take a look at 4A. 4A says, air is carried to the lungs in the trachea and bronchi, and then to the alveoli in bronchioles. Muscle contractions cause the pressure changes inside the thorax, that's your chest, fancy word for your chest, that force air in and out of the lungs to ventilate them. Different muscles are required for inspiration, breathing in, and expiration, breathing out, because muscles only do work when they contract. External and internal intercostal muscles. Fancy word. Have you guys ever eaten ribs? Yep. The meat that you eat, if you eat ribs, those are intercostal muscles, and those are the muscles that organisms use to breathe, in addition to the diaphragm and abdominal muscles. And then we will talk about what's called an antagonistic or opposite muscle action. So we need to hit some vocabulary. So let's hit 4A. So let's hit ventilation. So when they talk about ventilation, this is where when we first started talking about COVID and there was a shortage of ventilators. These are devices that simply forcibly drive air in and then pull air out of the lungs. That is a ventilator, whereas the verb ventilation is air into and out of the lungs. And the whole point of driving air in and out of the lungs is gas exchange. And so the whole point of gas exchange is diffusion of oxygen into the blood. But then equally as important is diffusion of CO2 out of the blood. So when you talk about gas exchange, be sure that you remember that it's both. Okay? In the lungs, you are doing both oxygen into the blood and carbon dioxide out. Okay? This is different than when you get into the capillaries. The capillary beds within any tissue, then it's the opposite. Oxygen out of the blood, carbon dioxide in. And these two gases are reactants and products, depending on where you are in the body. These are the reactants and products of which process?
Cellular respiration.
Totally. All of this stuff ultimately links back to cell resp. Okay? That's why it's so important. So when they dropped a whole ton of vocabulary on you in that core question, so let's diagram that. So if you reach here in your neck, in the very front, you'll feel these cartilaginous rings, these rings of cartilage, okay? And that's your trachea. That's the tube that leads to your lungs. So you have two tubes that go down in the back of your throat. This is the front tube, this is the trachea. And if you look at it from the top, behind the trachea is the esophagus, which is the tube to your stomach. So your trachea for your lungs is here, and the esophagus is then behind that. So let's get a different here. Pen work. There we go. So this is that front tube called the trachea. And then this tube then goes down and splits into two smaller tubes called bronchus individually. Plural is bronchi. So when you get a bacterial or viral infection in the lining of the bronchus, as the immune system pumps lymph, water, and white blood cells to this area, you get inflammation in this area. Now, the Latin root for inflammation is itis. And so when you have itis in your bronchi, you have bronchitis. Okay. And so people say, oh, I caught bronchitis. And you don't catch bronchitis. Bronchitis is a symptom. That's like saying, I caught a cough, I caught a sneeze, I caught a headache, right? You don't catch symptoms. You catch the microbes that cause the symptoms, right? So bronchitis is simply inflammation of the lining of the bronchus, singular, bronchi, wow, plural. Okay. So the trachea is large, then you get a little bit smaller, you get into the bronchus, then you get smaller still. This is now in the left lung and the right lung, like such. And these are called bronchioles. And then ultimately at the end of the bronchioles are these little pouches. Now, people tend to think of the lungs as a bag. That's not the way lung tissue really works. If you take lung tissue and cut it in half, it looks just like a sponge. Okay? You've seen the surface of a sponge. What does the surface of a sponge look like?
Porous.
Mm-hmm. Highly, highly porous. Okay? To trap the detergent or the soap, depending on what you're using the sponge for, which then allows the sponge to then make foam, which allows it to wash whatever we're trying to wash. So the lung tissue, I don't want you to think of the lung as a bag. Okay, it's not the way it works. It's a sponge. It's all of these little pockets, and each of these little pockets is called an alveolus. There are millions of these. And so plural, they are called alveoli. Alveoli, like such. Okay, so it's trachea, bronchus, bronchioles, alveoli, getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And then what happens is you get blood flow, like such. And the blood vessel then wraps around the alveoli and then comes back out. So the blood flow comes into the alveoli, gas exchange occurs, and then you get blood flow back out. And so the blood flow comes in, circle, 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 and then back out. Blood flow in, gas exchange, blood flow back out. Okay, so if you think of your hand, or actually the fist, if you think of the fist as the alveoli, then the blood vessels, right, the capillaries, then wrap around the alveoli just like this. It's a very, very intimate relationship between the walls of the alveoli and the walls of the capillary, which is why when people smoke for long periods of time, the lining of the alveoli thin and thin and thin and thin until eventually they're so thin that when the person collects the mucus in their lungs because they're smokers, when they then cough and drive that mucus out, the stress on the alveoli wall causes the wall to rupture, and they will commonly, long-term smokers, along with the mucus, will cough up some blood. It's common. Okay, so when you talk about these capillaries, these are capillaries here, right? And don't forget that in a capillary, those are those really, really, really thin blood vessels, right? That's right. So you can go into the bathroom, look in the mirror, you see a little red line. That's a capillary. Okay, so if you look at a capillary here, the red blood cells, we're not talking about the immune system now, we're talking about gas exchange, we're talking about red blood cells. The red blood cells, that's a B, there we go. The red blood cells line up single file in the capillary, right? And they slow down. So then what happens is the surface of the alveoli is then here. The alveolar surface is what it's called. This is a single alveolus. And then what you get is from the lungs into the blood is O2, and out of the blood and into the lungs is CO2. This whole idea that we breathe in oxygen and breathe out CO2 is all based on cellular respiration. But of course, you all know that about 75% of what we breathe in and out is actually nitrogen. The air that we breathe in is overwhelmingly nitrogen. Right? I think it's about 8-10% oxygen, I think, maybe 12%, something like that. I have to Google that to be sure. It's right around 10%, I think. So while this is a nice diagram, do you think the textbook includes a better one? Totally. Chapter 42 somewhere. Where is it? 40. Oh, that's cool. Cool number. 4224. So let's take a look at 4224. It'll be around here somewhere. Does anyone still need this diagram? Cool. 4224, looking like that. Should have a red pen around here. There we go. So here we have our patient, right? And we've peeled back some of her skin, and we are looking inside of her chest cavity. We are looking inside of her thorax. This is image 4224, the mammalian respiratory system. Okay, so the back of the throat here are her nasal cavities, right? Here's the oral cavity. We're looking at the back of the throat here, right? So in the back of the throat here is the pharynx. It's the very back of the throat. And then you have this tube in the front here. This tube in the front, this is your trachea. So if you go to the top of the trachea, you'll see these little lines here. That's where your vocal cords are. Okay, what people call the voice box. Okay, it's not a box at all. For some reason, they call it a voice box. Okay, it's actually two flaps of tissue that, depending on the density of the tissue, that establishes the tone of your voice. The more testosterone that you expose the vocal cords to, the more flexible they are. The more flexible they are, the lower the frequency that they vibrate, and thus the lower the voice. So this is why females' voices tend to be higher than male voices. It's a hormone thing based on the density of your vocal cords. Okay, but the location of the vocal cords right there at the top of the trachea is called the larynx. Larynx. So sometimes when you have a bacterial or viral infection, you will then get inflammation in your larynx, right? White blood cells and lymph are pumped to that area. It makes the tissue around the vocal cords rigid and reduces the flexibility of your vocal cords, and you will lose your voice because as the air passes over the vocal cords, the tissue cannot vibrate as it usually does, and you lose your voice. Okay, so then when they lose their voice, that is referred to as inflammation in your larynx. Therefore, it is larynxitis, which for some reason then people put a G in it and they pronounce it laryngitis. Okay, it's actually larynxitis, but people don't say larynxitis any more than they say Wednesday. Okay, they say laryngitis, and it's not spelled that way at all. Okay, and then they sneak in this little tube right here. Right here, they sneak in this back tube here, and so I'm going to sneak it in as well. And that's the esophagus. That's the tube to the stomach. All right, then your trachea goes down. Your trachea then splits into two smaller tubes. Individually, they are the bronchus. Together, they are the bronchi. The bronchi then branch out into smaller branches here. Those are bronchioles. Like such. And then what this image does, I should draw the diaphragm also. So the diaphragm here, it's skeletal muscle right at the base of your lungs. Here. And diaphragm's a fun word to spell. It looks like diaphragm. For some reason, the G is silent. Again, I don't know why. And that is the diaphragm is a piece of skeletal muscle that when it contracts, it expands the chest cavity, creates negative pressure, and the air rushes in. Cool. So then you go over here and they zoom in. So they zoom in right here. What they're zooming in on is the alveoli. So you come over here and this is the alveoli here. And then you also see it here. So this is why I told you the lung tissue is not a bag. Don't think of a balloon as your lungs. Think of a sponge, okay? And it is highly, highly porous. That increases the surface area, okay? We've talked a lot about surface area too. So if you think about the surface of the brain is not smooth. Surface of the brain is corrugated. Why? It increases surface area. You go inside the small intestine, the surface of the small intestine has the villi and then the microvilli. Why? More surface area. You look inside of the chloroplast, wiggly. Why? Surface area. Inside of the mitochondrion, wiggly. Why? Surface area. So, you get inside of the lungs, right? And you have all of this increased surface area. How much? This is what's cool. If you were to take the lung tissue of the average adult human and flatten it out, okay, it's the size of half of a tennis court per lung. Okay, so imagine a piece of paper or a sheet or something that large. Imagine the size of half of a tennis court. How do you get half of a tennis court to fit here in your chest? What would you have to do to that piece of paper?
Compress it.
Compress it, right? So if I take a piece of paper, right? Oh, is this a drawing of? Oh, pregnancy, right? I take a piece of paper. Imagine this, the size of a tennis court, and I crush it up to fit inside of your lung. What does the surface of it look like?
Small.
Yeah. Okay. What's the surface look like? Is it smooth?
No,
Oh,
rough.
it's rough. It's highly, highly, highly porous. Okay. So I want you to see that whether you're talking about the surface of the brain, you're talking about the cristae inside of the mitochondrion, you're talking about the alveoli inside of the lungs, you're talking about the villi and the microvilli inside of the small intestine, surface area. It's a fundamental concept in biology. So if this is the alveoli, then what is this structure here? Pardon? Totally, that's a bronchial. Nice, you're going backwards here. It is a bronchiole because it's singular. All right, now they are implying with color here, because you guys know your blood's only blue once, right? They are implying oxygen poor, oxygen rich. Let's tie this back to the heart. Which blood vessel is that?
Vein.
Artery?
Which is it? We have a vein, we have an artery. What do you think?
Well, artery brings blood away from the heart.
Yes. So this is going away from the heart, therefore it's an artery. Which artery? Well, you're going to the lung. How do you say lung in Spanish?
Oh, pulmonary artery.
Yeah, because lung in Spanish, of course, pulmón, right? Thus, it's a Latin root because Spanish is a Latin language, right? Thus, this is a pulmonary artery. Super easy to teach that to a mostly bilingual population. Can you imagine standing in the middle of Iowa and going, hey, how do you say Spanish for lung? And they'd be like, well, we don't know, right? Okay, so then if this is the pulmonary artery, what is this over here?
A vein?
A vein, totally agree. Which vein?
Pulmonary vein?
Pulmonary. Why is it pulmonary? It's pulmonary because it deals with the
The lungs?
lungs. Totally. Okay, that's why CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. That P for pulmonary, Latin root, lung. Okay. And so again, here you see the very, very intimate relationship between the alveoli like such and the capillary beds, like a glove around the outside for gas exchange. So when you then see the capillaries, I might go thick black on that so that you can see it, otherwise it's red on red. So these would be capillaries here. So these are the capillaries here, and these are the capillaries there, like such. And that's your lung tissue. Make sure you can go over there. All right, are you comfortable with that? I got a mouse there, we go. Comfortable with that diagram, you okay? 4224 for question 4A. Awesome. All right, so we're talking about ventilation. Why? Why ventilate? We all know breathing is important. If you don't breathe, you pass away. So why? Why ventilate?
Because we need oxygen.
There you go. Ventilation is required for oxygen. For oxygen to do what? Where must the oxygen go?
Cells?
Yes, into the cells, and first it must go into the blood. So in order to transport the oxygen from the air into your blood, heart beat, 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 drive the oxygen to the cell, into the blood, then to the cells, these somatic cells, right? Because of course what we're talking about here is oxygen for which process?
Cellular respiration.
Cellular respiration. This is why back in core 2, when we did photosynthesis and cellular respiration, I said we're going to talk about cellular respiration all the time. It's a crime that it's not taught in 3rd and 4th grade. Okay? Why? Because cell resp is the biochemical process that manufactures what chemical energy molecule?
ATP.
ATP. And that's what it's all about. That's why you have to breathe, right? If you don't breathe, you don't receive oxygen. If you don't diffuse oxygen into your blood, your cells can't do cell resp. If your cells can't do cell resp, then they don't have ATP. All right, so that's ventilating, that's air in. So what we're talking about then is doing cell resp. What cell resp does is it metabolizes, or it digests, or it breaks down, hydrolyzes, pick a word, good grief, macromolecules. Proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, carbohydrates. Fine. Aerobic cellular respiration requires oxygen. So your reactants. It's an enzyme-mediated process. Fine. What are your products?
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide.
Oh, water.
Water.
And ATP.
Amen to that. Right. So this is what ventilation is all about. Breathe this in, breathe this out. That's ventilation right there. And ultimately, the CO2 that we breathe out comes from what molecules?
The macromolecules.
Yep, the food that we eat. The food that you eat is really nothing more than carbon dioxide with high energy electrons bonded to it. You rip out the high energy electrons, use them to make ATP, that's core 8, right? And now you're left with the CO2 holder of the electrons. What do I do with that? You breathe it out. Decarboxylate the macromolecules and breathe it out. Simple. This all ties back to chemistry. Cool. So more specific step in ventilation is when you inhale. And what happens here is the diaphragm contracts. And what this actually does, okay? You have the diaphragm here, the base of your ribs, okay? Now, I'm going to mention breathing, and now, unfortunately, for about the next 5 minutes, you guys have to think about your breathing, because usually your breathing is controlled by the medulla oblongata in the base of your brain, where your spinal cord runs into your brain. It's called the brainstem, and where that spinal cord and the brain meet right back here in the base of your brain, that usually controls your breathing rate, okay? But now that I've mentioned it, I've reminded the frontal part of your brain that you can control the skeletal muscle. So right now, what you guys unfortunately are having to do is you're having to think about your breathing, because now I've mentioned it, okay? And then after we get done talking about it, you'll forget that you have to control your breathing, and then the medulla will take it over again. So what happens here is the diaphragm contracts. When the diaphragm contracts, it drives down, okay? When the diaphragm drives down, that increases the volume of your thorax. It increases the volume of your chest. Well, in chemistry, you did P1V1 equals P2V2. Basic chemistry equation, yes?
Yep.
Yep.
Yes.
What is P and V? Wow. P1V1, P2V2. What do P and V stand for?
The words just escape my mind.
P is for pressure, and V is for volume. Holy smokes. If you guys are considering being bio majors, you may want to take a summer chemistry class before you go to college. Or when you guys sign up for your college chemistry, don't go for the upper level class. You may want to what's called remediate, and you may want to take an entry level chem class, okay? Because you're going to be competing with students who know their chemistry really, really well. So if you're thinking about being a bio major, holy cow, do you guys need some chem. All right, so in order for this to stay the same, in order for there to be no change in this value, when I take a breath and my diaphragm drives down, what happens to the volume of my lungs as my diaphragm drives down? The volume of my lungs does what?
Compresses.
Pardon?
Compresses.
Okay, so if my diaphragm drives down and my lungs are
Oh, it
straight,
expands. Expands.
yeah, it expands. So the volume increases. If there's no change on this side of the equation, if this goes up, if your volume goes up, what has to happen to your pressure?
Drop.
Has to drop, right? This is an indirect or inverse relationship, okay? So surrounding us is what we call 1 atmosphere of pressure, okay? That's what we call atmospheric pressure, fine, okay? So impulse goes to my diaphragm drives down, the volume of my lungs increases, the pressure drops, and I now have less pressure in my lungs than the pressure out here. So guess what the air then does?
Escapes your lungs into the atmosphere.
So when I lower my pressure in my lungs, that's going to cause the air to go out.
You lower the pressure.
If I lower the pressure in my lungs, so I have a lower pressure here than what's out here in the atmosphere. What does the air do?
It's gonna go in.
Darn right, air is going to drive in. Okay. So what really, this whole idea of, oh, we're sucking in air, that's really not what happens. Okay. The diaphragm drives down, you reduce the pressure in your lungs, and actually the atmospheric pressure pushes the air in. That's actually what causes us to breathe in. It has everything to do with the inverse relationship between pressure and volume. So,
So air is pushed in.
Isn't that cool?
Like we don't do it, it's
Correct.
pushed in.
Correct. So if you put someone in what's called a hyperbaric chamber, and as you drop the pressure in the hyperbaric chamber, it gets harder and harder to breathe because you're dropping the atmospheric pressure. So when the diaphragm drives down, there should be a difference in pressure that draws the air in, and you drop the diaphragm, and you can't get any air in. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Welcome to working in submarines, by the way. There's rules in submarines. Oh man, they play games with pressure. It's craziness. All right. So the diaphragm contracts and decreases the pressure. This is why it's important that you're comfortable with P1V1 equals P2V2. So it decreases the pressure in the chest cavity. And that's what actually causes the air to rush in. Same thing happens with a straw. You go up to a straw, right? It's in the fluid. When you suck on the straw, you suck the air in. When you suck the air in, there is now less pressure in the straw. Atmospheric pressure on the liquid, and that actually pushes the liquid up into the straw. It's physics, and it's super cool. All right, so I think that's a good place to
Mr.
stop.
Rano,
Yes.
I got a quick question. So, like, I don't know if anybody else has tried this, but like when they're drinking with a straw, and like they use two straws, and one straw is like outside of the cup and one's inside, and it's like
Yep.
really hard to drink your whatever you're drinking. And like, why is that?
Because you are restricting the, okay, when you drink, the fluid then goes into the straw. If you don't allow air into the container to replace the volume that you're taking out, then there's going to be resistance to you drinking out of that cup because you have to replace the volume that you're pulling out. Otherwise, it creates a vacuum and doesn't allow you to take out any more fluid. Yeah, this is all called fluid dynamics, and it's taught in physics. It's really cool stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yep. People say, oh, physics is boring. And I'm like, oh, physics is awesome. All right, so I need to cut you guys loose to third period. For the majority of you, that's math. And so let's see, I will see you Tuesday, and then we will meet with Grove Tuesday afternoon. I've already posted the URL in the Facebook group, and then I will start the registration process for your exams on Saturday. And if there are any questions, you'll start seeing my texts about 3, 4, 5 o'clock on Saturday. Hopefully I don't have to text any of you, and it's just really super smooth, but we'll see. Some years it's smooth, some years it's not. I never know until I get into it. But hopefully we'll start class on Tuesday, and I'll say, hey, everybody's registered. And then when I finish registering all of you, I will then publish your registrations, and I really need you to look over my shoulder. I need you to double check every single detail, your name, your birth date, the exams that you're registered for, TOK, Spanish SL or HL, that we picked up your math, all the details. So I always want you to double check my work. But we'll do that next week. Get out of here. Go do third period. Have a wonderful day, and I will catch you guys after the weekend. Have a great weekend.